The keel of the great United States super dreadnought battleship, now known as Number 39, which, with her sister ship, the Pennsylvania, is the biggest fighting vessel built or building for any navy, was laid with appropriate ceremonies in the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn yesterday morning. The first keel plate was nailed in place by Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, while the Navy Yard band played the Star-Spangled Banner, and the little crowd of officers, blue jackets, their families and friends stood uncovered. It was an impressive moment, and there was none in the throng who did not realize that the banging of the hammer meant the actual beginning of construction of the biggest ship ever built in New York, and with the sole exception of the Pennsylvania, now in course of construction at Newport News, the largest ever constructed in this hemisphere. The ceremony of laying the keel was planned to take place at 10 o'clock on last Friday morning, but was postponed until 11 o'clock yesterday morning by order of the Navy Department in order to make possible the presence of Assistant Secretary Roosevelt. Secretary Roosevelt arrived at the yard a few minutes after 11 o'clock, the firing of a salute of 17 guns from the super dreadnought North Dakota announcing his coming. He was met by Captain Albert Gleaves, Commandant of the yard, Commander Hutchinson, the senior aide, and Lieutenant Commander Newton, the junior aide. These officers escorted Mr. Roosevelt to the great cradle in which Number 39 will be built. There he was greeted by naval constructors Robert Stocker and James E. Bailey, the officials who will direct the construction of the great freighter. Immediately after the arrival of Mr. Roosevelt, the giant traveling crane above the cradle of the battleship to be began to move. It carried a massive steel plate and dropped it at the spot designated by the constructors. Then Mr. Roosevelt stepped forward. Captain Glaves handed him a silver-plated bolt. Mr. Roosevelt quickly hammered it into place while the band played the national anthem, and the crowd stood with bared heads. As soon as Mr. Roosevelt's part of the work was finished, 4 little boys stepped forward. One was Robert Stocker, Jr., son of the chief constructor at the Navy Yard. Another, J. E. Bailey, Jr., whose father will devote all his time to the building of the ship. Son of Lieutenant Commander Claverius, Jr., and a grandson of the late Rear Admiral Sampson, and Woodbury Bird, son of Captain Bird, the engineer officer at the Navy Yard. These little chaps each drove a spike into place, and, that work finished, they ran to the place where the bow will be nailed, and nailed an old horseshoe for good luck on one of the temporary wooden supports of the cradle. Captain Gleaves closed the ceremony with a short speech. The USS Arizona is one of the most famous battleships of the 20th century, though not for reasons that those who served aboard her would have liked, especially in her last days. Her legacy is one of both service and tragedy, an icon of the Second World War and the beginning of America's all-out involvement in the conflict, the consequences of which can still be seen almost a century later. Her story begins well ahead of her own construction, the embryonic inspiration of her steel frame forming within writings that had been published some 20 years prior to her actual conception. Alfred Thayer Mahan was a United States naval officer, veteran of the American Civil War, historian, and perhaps most critically, an author. Although he would go on to publish a number of works emphasizing the importance of naval strength on the world stage, none would prove to be as impactful or as consequential as his first book. Published in 1890, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, would fundamentally fertilize the minds of many powerful governments around the world, most of which were already aiming to commence, defend, or even expand their own imperial holdings across the globe. This would include the likes of Imperial Germany, Great Britain, France, and the United States. Mahan's doctrine, aside from other comprehensive observations and proposals, essentially emphasized the importance of possessing large, powerful fleets that could gain supremacy of the seas in order for nations to sustain and/or acquire their dominance on the world stage. Such a position was not difficult to comprehend considering the track record of European powers using control of the high seas to manage their own empires throughout the ages, something that Mahan draws upon in his own observations. What would unfold as a result would be the international race for naval supremacy that would characterize the opening decades of the early 20th century. The United States, for its part, was intent on fashioning dreadnoughts to replace its earlier generation of battleships, many of whom had sailed as part of America's famed Great White Fleet. These would not be just simple replacements, however, but were to be constructed with planned improvements. These would be the standard type battleship, so called for their standardized design. Their primary focus was on providing the Navy with a fleet of ships possessing similar operational characteristics to allow for smoother, more coordinated operations against enemy battleships. The standard type included features such as the all-or-nothing armor scheme, a method of naval warship armor first pioneered by the standard type. It prioritized the protection of the most critical parts of a ship by providing them with the thickest armor, such as magazines, engine rooms, and command centers, while leaving other less vital areas with virtually no protection at all. With the expectation of longer-ranged engagements against enemy battleships, it was anticipated that armor-piercing shells would be able to hit anywhere on a ship, but would be useless against thick enough armor. Therefore, thicker armor was employed for the vessel's vitals, ensuring that it could continue to function in a combat scenario even if struck directly on the deck by long-ranged plunging fire. All of this, of course, came at the expense of other less critical areas on the ship, hence the term all or nothing. In this regard, the standard type dreadnoughts were drastically ahead of their time, since the other major powers of the era would not come to the same conclusion until after the Mahan-style Battle of Jutland in 1916. Moving towards armaments, the placement of all main guns was to be on the center line of the ships, in fore and aft turrets without any guns amidships. As for transportation, they were to possess a range of about 8,000 nautical miles or 15,000 kilometers at cruising speed, a top speed of 21 knots or 39 kilometers per hour, and a tactical turn radius of 700 yards. Moreover, these would be the first ever battleships employed by the US Navy to rely on oil instead of coal. Even with the intention of standardization already in place, the Bureau of Construction and Repair, or CNR, the part of the US Navy responsible for the designing and construction of its ships at the time, would implement gradual improvements on successive classes of the standard type. These were often based on problems or advantages observed from previous classes. Overall, 5 classes of ships would be constructed under the designation of standard type, beginning with the Nevada class. Named somewhat ironically in the first case, after the 36th and 46th states of the Union, the USS Nevada and USS Oklahoma, BB-36 and BB-37, made up the Nevada class. These second-generation behemoths were much larger than their first-generation predecessors, possessing much heavier displacements, as well as 4 triple-gun turrets. The pair would go on to set the schematic groundwork for the rest of their nigh-identical cousins. Republican President William Howard Taft, despite his continued support of his successor Theodore Roosevelt's policy of 2 new battleships a year, faced strong opposition from the Democrats. The latter had gained control of the House of Representatives in 1910, ending 16 years of being in the opposition. With caucuses that were against the production of more battleships, the Democratic majority approved only 1 battleship for the fiscal year of 1913, the USS Pennsylvania. Her sister ship, named after the 48th state of the Union, the USS Arizona, would be the only authorized battleship for the following fiscal year of 1914. This was despite arguments by then Secretary of the Navy George von Lengerke for 3 battleships, pointing to the previous policy of 2 per year and how only Pennsylvania had been approved in 1913. Nevertheless, refusals from Congress ensured that his request was relegated to only 1. This proved to be to the then unnamed Battleship 39's favor, however. It was able to begin construction much earlier than usual, its authorization being approved on March 4, 1913. To close the gap in production time between Battleship 39 and her sister, the Pennsylvania, the ship's contract was handed down to a Navy-owned shipyard, the New York Navy Yard, before the end of the year. Her keel was laid down less than 5 months after the Pennsylvania's, on the morning of March 16, 1914, exactly 1 year and 12 days since her authorization. Then Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt was present to hammer her very first bolt into place. Set by the new Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, and acted upon by her builders, they intended to set a world record of 10 months between her keel laying and her launch. Pennsylvania was set to be ready for her own launch after 14 months, 2 months ahead of the American record. Given when construction began for Arizona, she was hoped to get out on her own 2 feet at least a month after her sister. Once again, the intention may have been to close the gap in their respective production schedules that had been created by Congress's opposition to further battleship construction. The battleship found her beginnings on the same slipways that had been vacated by her predecessor, USS New York, just 5 months earlier. Initially, her name had not yet been decided. According to the New York Times, it was a toss-up between the New Mexico, the North Carolina, and the Arizona. Interestingly, the first would go on to be the name of both the battleship and class that would come directly after 39. The second would mark the beginning of an entirely different class and generation of US battleship. In this case, the third would be the one to actually stick. With a displacement of 31,400 tons, She was going to be twice the size of the famous flagship of the Great White Fleet, USS Connecticut. She would also be more than 11,000 tons heavier than her older Delaware-class cousins, USS Delaware and USS North Dakota. She was even planned to be 5,000 tons heavier than the Wyoming-class dreadnought USS Wyoming, which was contemporaneously the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet under Rear Admiral Charles Shea Badger. More than 1,100 officers and crew were expected to be required in order to man her, and she was to be fitted to burn oil as well as coal. Likewise, her construction was believed to require a similarly sized workforce of 1,000 mechanics. Naval constructor John E. Bailey, who was in charge of the construction of the aforementioned New York, was also slated as the head of the construction corps for the battleship to be. As New York Navy constructors were busy making the arrangements for her keel laying in July of 1913, 5 other ships were also in the midst of their own construction phases. By this time, the new USS Texas, the sister of New York, was 90% finished. USS Nevada and USS Oklahoma were 37.1% and 33% finished respectively, while Pennsylvania, 39's own sister, was only 2% finished. Different news sources provided different estimations for Arizona's overall cost at different times. On July 13, 1913, a New York Times article stated that exclusive of armor and armament, it would cost the government $7,435,000 and a whopping total of $16 million when ready for commissioning. However, on June 13th, exactly 1 month earlier, the Boston Evening Transcript set the work then underway to reach $11,453,590 by July 1st. Congress itself had initially set her construction budget at no higher than $7,425,000. However, her final construction cost reached almost twice that, at more than $13 million. This comes up to about $403,198,282.83 in today's currency. Back then, the final amount was more than $1.5 million above the Evening Transcript's estimation, and approximately $3 million shy of the New York Times' estimation. Though her construction had started out with grand ambitions for setting a world record even faster than that set for her older sister, the USS Arizona would not meet her deadline. In fact, by March 21, 1915, more than a year after the laying of her keel, she was only 53% finished, her sister Pennsylvania having already launched the previous Tuesday on the 16th of March, just 5 days earlier. Pennsylvania had likewise fallen 3 months behind her expected launch date, though this perhaps was not as large a delay as that faced by the Arizona, which was anticipated to take 10 months to launch, but in reality required 5 more. The New York Times had set its most likely launch date at some point in June of that same year, which, in hindsight, would end up proving much more accurate. The Navy's newest battleship was ready for launch. The exact date for the event was set for June 19, 1915, some 15 months after her keel had been laid. As anticipated, she possessed an overall length of 608 feet or 185.3 meters. Her beam was 97 feet or 29.6 meters at the waterline. Her draft was 29 feet, 3 inches when at deep load. She had a displacement of 29,158 long tons or 29,625 tons at standard. At deep load, however, she came up to as much as 31,197 long tons or 32,429 tons. This placed her at over 4,000 long tons or around 4,480 tons more than the older Nevadas. At the time of her launch, she had a crew numbering 56 officers and 1,031 enlisted men. In terms of movement, the Arizona relied on 4 direct drive Parsons steam turbine sets. Each drove a propeller that was 12 feet 1.5 inches or 3.7 meters in diameter. Steam was used from 12 Babcock and Wilcox boilers. The turbines were designed to produce a total of 34,000 shaft horsepower or 25,000 kilowatts. However, she achieved only 33,376 shaft horsepower or 24,888 kilowatts during her sea trials. She was ultimately still able to meet her design speed of 21 knots, 39 kilometers per hour, or 24 miles per hour. Her construction meant that she could carry enough oil to steam at a speed of 12 knots, 22 kilometers per hour, or 14 miles per hour for a pre-planned distance of at least 8,000 nautical miles, 15 kilometers, or 9,200 miles, so long as her bottom was clear of ocean debris. Moving on to her armaments, the Arizona had been fitted with 12 45 caliber 14-inch guns set in triple gun turrets. These turrets, built in alignment with the ship's center line, were numbered 1 to 4 from front to rear. 2 50 caliber 3-inch 76mm guns were to be used for anti-aircraft defense. 2 more would be added afterwards, the pair being placed atop turret 3 at the rear of the ship. Approximately 22 51 caliber 5-inch 127mm guns were mounted in individual casemates in the sides of the hull to provide anti-torpedo defense. However, due to their positioning so close to the waterline, they were often vulnerable to sea spray and cannot be operated in heavy seas. Lastly, a pair of 21-inch 533mm underwater torpedo tubes were built with one on each broadside. Finally, there was her armor. Her waterline armor belt was composed of Krupp armor, a type of steel naval armor deployed by Germany's Krupp Arms Works some 20 years earlier, one that had become the standard for Navy ship protection. In keeping with the all-or-nothing principle introduced by the Nevada class, it was 13.5 inches or 343mm thick, and covered only the machinery spaces and magazines. The belt had a total height of 17 feet 6 inches or 5.3 meters, 8 feet 9.75 inches or 2.7 meters of which lay below the waterline. Beginning 2 feet 4 inches or 0.7 meters below the waterline itself, the belt was tapered to a minimum thickness of 8 inches or 203 millimeters. Within the ship itself, transverse bulkheads had been built at each end, ranging from 8 inches to 13 inches in thickness. Back topside, the faces of the 4 major gun turrets were each given 18 inches or 457mm thick armor, the sides being 9 to 10 inches or 229 to 225mm thick. The turret roofs were protected by 5 inches or 127mm of armor, while the armor of the barbets was set at 4.5 to 18 inches or 114 to 457mm thick. The conning tower was protected by 16 inches or 406mm of armor and had a roof 8 inches thick. The boiler uptakes were similarly protected by a conical mantlet that ranged from 9 to 15 inches or 230 to 380mm in thickness. The main armor deck was 3 plates thick, with a total thickness of 3 inches. Additional armor was used to protect the steering gear, a 3-inch torpedo bulkhead, and came along with a complete double bottom for the whole ship. Now as for the launch itself. The Arizona, the biggest of the super dreadnoughts of our Navy, was launched at the Brooklyn Navy Yard yesterday afternoon, while 75,000 people, the greatest crowd that ever gathered to see an American ship go down the ways, cheered to the echo Uncle Sam's newest battleship, named for the newest of the states. Everybody in that mighty crowd grew prouder from the moment Miss Esther Ross, the sponsor, smashed the 2 ribboned bottles, one containing American champagne and the other Arizona water, against the Arizona's bow, until the fleet of tugs overhauled the great freighter under the Williamsburg Bridge and dragged her back to the Navy Yard, there to receive the armament that is to make her one of the 2 most powerful of the fighting units of the Atlantic Fleet, the other unit being the Arizona's great sister, the Pennsylvania, future flagship of the fleet's commander-in-chief. The weather was perfect. There was no fog to dim the view of the thousands, there was no rain to dampen their enthusiasm, there was just enough breeze to fan the spectators. The crowd began to assemble 3 hours before the hour of the spring tide, which was at exactly 1 p.m., and by noon 9/10 of the crowd were in their places. In the yard proper, in and beyond the roped-off spaces, to the right and left of the giant cradle in which the Arizona rested, were grouped more than 50,000 people. It would seem that this would mean a lot of crowding, but such was not the case, and polite Marines darted here and there, seeing that those that had white tickets got their proper places, that the other thousands who held blue and red and other colored tickets were in the right places. Hospital stewards were on duty, and ambulances held in readiness to give quick aid in case of an accident or sickness. Never were arrangements more perfectly planned, and never more perfectly executed. But nobody became ill. There were no accidents and no arrests. In that crowd of 75,000, so far as the police and naval records show, there was not one person who misbehaved. Up to the very moment when the Arizona got underway and started majestically down the greased ways, the bang, bang, bang of the giant hammers kept the crowd keyed up in anticipation of what was coming. For 2 hours before the command to, quote, saw off was given, the Navy Yard workmen, hidden from view beneath the giant ship, hammered away, knocking the permanent supports out of position. The launching trigger hydraulic rams were tested at 11 a.m. and found to be in perfect working condition. Then the official clocks were set, and 100 men began to pour more than 23,000 pounds of tallow and lard over the ways that led down into the water. At 12:30 p.m., the great cantilever crane that rested on its tracks just after the bow of the Arizona began to move in the direction of the river. As it got underway, a big red flag was broken out, the signal to the thousands on shore and the other thousands on the decks of the super dreadnoughts of the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the Atlantic Fleet, which were in the Navy Yard, that the moment of the launching was near. A fleet of tugs steamed out into the river, and patrol launches skipped about to see that no venturesome craft got into the waters of the launching zone. The Arizona was going to hit the water at a speed of more than 15 knots, and the orders were that no precaution must be neglected for the safety of river and ocean-going craft. At 1 o'clock, the Navy Yard was as quiet as a graveyard. All eyes were focused on the big red hull that was about to start down the ways. Naval Constructor Robert Stalker and his chief assistant, Naval Constructor Johnny Bailey, were on the ground near the bow of the super dreadnought. Miss Ross, Governor Hunt of Arizona, the Mrs. Eva Ben, Soleil King, and Mary Farrell, the Maids of Honor, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, Admiral Fletcher, the Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, Vice Admiral Mayo, second in command of the fleet, Mayor Mitchell, General Leonard Wood, USA, and more than 100 other prominent people were in the flag-decorated grandstand just under the overhang of the bow of the mighty warship. 2 bottles dangled at the ends of 2 ropes, each wound round and round with red, white, and blue ribbons. In one was the wine, and in the other, a quart of the first water that flowed over the Great Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. Miss Ross held a bottle in each hand. Below her, she could see Stalker and Bailey, builders of the Arizona, the 2 men responsible above all others for the successful launching of the biggest ship ever built by the government in one of its own yards. All the ships in the Navy Yard were full dressed in honor of their newest sister. These ships were the Super Dreadnought Wyoming, from which fluttered the 4-starred pennant of Fletcher, the New York, from which was displayed the 3-starred flag of Mayo, the Utah, the Arkansas, the Florida, and the Texas, 2 flotillas of destroyers, another of the submarines, several auxiliaries, and the old battleship Maine, now used as a receiving ship. There were 4 giant flags streaming in the wind from the Arizona, and another, bigger than all the rest, was draped over the bow. Beneath it, the wine and the water were to mingle. On the Arizona were 200 picked bluejackets, who were to handle the hawsers when the tugs overtook the Arizona and made her ready to tow her back to the yard. The picture was one never to be forgotten. There were people everywhere. Half a dozen Marine bands from the Navy Yard and the ships of the Atlantic Fleet stood at attention, ready to start the Star-Spangled Banner when the Arizona began to move. Bishop Atwood of the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona uttered a short prayer. It was heard only by those immediately about him. Among other things, he prayed that the Arizona might prove to be an honor to the Navy and a protection to Americans, including those who travel on the high seas. He ended with the Lord's Prayer at 1:05 p.m. Constructor Bailey whispered to the men at either end of the giant saw to begin to, quote, saw off. A minute, then 2 minutes passed, and the grating of the saw as it cut through the last and biggest of the holding blocks could be heard by all the thousands who stood with eyes upon the Arizona, waiting for the first movement of the ship. On every dreadnought and every destroyer, a bluejacket stood with his hand on the siren cords, ready to join in the noisy concert that was to start the moment the Arizona was underway. Suddenly, and very quietly, everybody saw the Arizona moving. Slowly at first, and very gracefully, and noiselessly, she started for her home in the water. Miss Ross drew back the ribbon-bound ropes and shouted, "I name thee Arizona!" The bottles crashed against the side of the Super Dreadnought, now gaining momentum with every inch. The stern struck the water, and the bluejackets on the deck of the ship shouted and waved and then shouted some more. On shore, the thousands cheered and cheered and cheered. The music of the bands, all playing the national anthem, was doomed in the noise. Every siren in the yard bellowed its loudest. Secretary Daniels, Admiral Fletcher, General Wood, Vice Admiral Mayo, Mayor Mitchell, and big, handsome Governor Hunt looked on and smiled their pride in the latest accomplishment of the New York Navy Yard. Miss Ross and her maids of honor and all the other women folk on the stands just looked at the wonderful picture that began on shore and was already ending in the water. Stalker and Bailey, the builders of the Arizona, watched the vessel until she was entirely afloat, and then they looked at each other, and it was as plain as daylight that they were the 2 happiest officers in the United States Navy. They didn't say it, so far as is known, but they certainly had a look that indicated a fervent "thank heaven" when at last they realized that the biggest and most ticklish of their great task had been accomplished. It was exactly 1:10 p.m. when the Arizona started down the ways, and 2 minutes later she was afloat. 5 minutes later, the tugs were alongside, and by 2 o'clock, the Arizona was fast alongside her dock in the Navy Yard, where she will receive her armament, engines, and other equipment. A year from now, she could be ready to take her place in the 1st Division of the Atlantic Fleet.